Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our lecture on advanced topics in color. This is continuation of Unit 9. When we last left off, we were talking about Monet and about ambient color. And I was just wanting to, just kind of remind you about what we had talked about in the first art historical lecture of this unit, which was Monet basically rented a room right across from the cathedral, and every day he painted. He painted the same view. Almost all the paintings are from the exact same view. Some are from slightly different views, but mostly the exact same view, over and over again. And had multiple paintings, one for pretty much each hour of the day, and some for specific kind of weather conditions, specific kind of lighting situations. And each painting he would work on, just developing it, figuring out, what am I seeing right now in this moment? And the point of this is that he was looking for the color of the light rather than the color of the object. The cathedral itself is almost purely neutral, so it's this neutral thing that he can find all of these different color relationships on. And so the first part of this lecture on color, we were talking about ambient color, the general idea that the color that we see is not the same thing as the color of the object, and that the notion that an object has a particular color is primarily illusionary. It's a trick of our mind, and that seeing color really carefully and accurately requires training. It requires the artist to really study and look. Um, and this is something that artists were really, once we got into the end of the 19th century, and artists had a much wider range of colors to work with, had paints in tubes, so they could ready at hand pull up any color that they wanted. It really opened people's eyes to how much there was to learn about how color works. So the next part of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about some more advanced understandings about the color wheel and why they're relevant. So we're going to go back a little bit. If you remember in the first lecture, we talked about the color wheel, and we talked about the fact that traditionally there are 3 primary colors and 3 secondary colors. We talked about how those 3 primary colors are different if we're talking about reflective color that like paint, that is, and we call that subtractive color, right? And in those systems, the traditional 3 primaries are yellow, red, and blue. But in terms of projected light, what we call the additive color system, those 3 colors are green, red, and blue, and the blue is, a darker, more indigo sort of blue. And those, but also we talked about how with those 3 primaries of the additive system, the projected light system, they create 3 secondary colors, which are yellow, cyan, and magenta. So technically, those should be the 3 primary colors in painting, in reflective color or in subtractive color. And that is, to a degree, kind of true. It works great in printing systems, that's for sure. But I think, as painters would say, neither, you can't make a good painting just having yellow, one red, one blue, plus black and white, and you'd still be struggling if you did the same thing, only replaced your red and your blue with a magenta and a cyan. And if you had all of them combined, you'd have a little bit more room, but still you probably would need a green. And that's an interesting point. Why would we need a green? And here's something to think about. Like the color wheel, like the color wheels that we studied when we were kids, all are geared around the idea. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of the lecture. They're all geared around the idea that the color is a wheel, right? It's a circle. And they're also geared around, they're built on the premise that the spacing is even, right? That the distance from yellow to red, or to to the other side, to the blue, that the distances are the same, right? And that the divisions of primaries and secondaries are the same. That if orange is exactly halfway between yellow and red, and green is exactly halfway between yellow and blue, then the distance from yellow to green and the distance from yellow to orange should be the same. But if we look at the CIE Chromaticity diagram here, you start to see that that's not really true. The spacing between yellow to orange is really small, whereas the space that's devoted in this chart to all the different kinds of colors that are different kinds of green is much bigger. And what that actually reflects what we see in the real world, which is there are so many more varieties of green, right, than would just be fit into a normal color wheel. Another interesting thing about the CIE is notice how the bottom part of the diagram just cuts off. It's just a straight line, and that's basically the point where the ultraviolets and the infrareds go out of the visible spectrum. So basically that's where our eyes stop working. And so we're expanding the color wheel. So one way to expand the color wheel is to rethink the shape, to say maybe it doesn't need to be a perfectly symmetrical circle and everything doesn't need to be completely balanced. And that is correct. It shouldn't be that way. It is actually more oddly shaped. And the distances between some colors are much closer to each other, and the distance between others is much more spread out. But another way is to think of the color wheel as a three-dimensional model. And a thinker, Munsell, came up with this system back in the 30s, I think, in which he came up with a three-dimensional model that thought about value, right, using a scale of 0 to 10, right, in terms of grays, and thought of it in terms of value and intensity. The further out you go on the branches, right, the more intense the color. The closer you go to the middle, the more neutral the colors get. And this three-dimensional model, he came up with this idea that he was not the first person to come up with the idea of making a 3D model for color, but he was the first person to figure out that the model could not be a perfect sphere. Lots and lots of theorists and artists tried to make models where they were thinking about how color would be organized, value, intensity, and hue, and they all had this kind of three-dimensional model with value going up and down, but they all assumed that it had to be a perfect sphere. And Munsell realized that each hue is different, right? That for this particular hue of yellow-orange, it's going to be the most intense at a specific value level, right? And it's going to drop off. There's no such thing as that hue being really, really intense and really, really dark. Whereas for this blue slightly on the cyan side, once again, there's another value level, right? Close to the mid value is where it's most intense. But then it drops off if it gets lighter. It will not, there is no really, really intense version of it at a lighter value, or for that matter, at a darker value. So that really kind of changes your understanding of how all of color works, and especially if you can really kind of wrap your mind around it and think about how this model changes how you think about the structure of the color wheel in general, and how this model makes you think about how value, intensity, and hue all interact. It gives you a much more accurate understanding of how color actually works. So in the 20th century, we started to see artists who were really, how much time do I have? We're about time for a break, who were really thinking about color from this kind of scientific point of view. And when they started to think about like how does color work, they started to make artwork that was demonstrations of their experimental understanding. So these Joseph Albert paintings are very much part of that tradition. And what he's demonstrating is what I call the principle of color relativity, which is that every color that we see is different depending on context. All right, we'll talk about that more in the third part of this lecture.